During this constitutional crisis, we have to let go of imposter syndrome for reals because it's something that I struggled through all the time because ultimately I know that I have expertise, I know that I have degrees, I know that I have the experience, and I know that's what actually guiding me to navigate through these complexities of the modern times, right? But I always question myself because I'm like, maybe we didn't have a constitutional crisis in January, right? Maybe there is hope because all these lawyers are saying, right, it's illegal, it's unconstitutional, so maybe I just don't know any better because I don't have a JD, right? But in fact, they were not trained to actually challenge authoritarian law because American law is focused on obedience to superior orders. That very much doesn't have to be a constitutional order if that's through an authority that is higher than you, right? So ultimately, I question the way that I am thinking through these political complexities, right? And it's always validating when there's people of status who actually uphold those predictions or those conclusions, right? And in the video that I will tag, there's a law school professor and a lawyer who touches upon something that I touched on my primary, which is now permanently banned because I touched upon what she actually said that we should do, which is right, transition from grief and to anger, right? And because of that, I didn't have any strikes, I didn't have any warnings, but they saw me as a threat because I had 18,000 followers that they permanently banned me without even a warning, right? But ultimately, what I had positioned there is that the courts, particularly the Supreme Court, will want litigation to extend far and wide, right? They will want to just breadcrumb us. They're not going to go all out in ruling for everything that his side wants, but they're going to just give us enough to where we don't think that they're not independent, right? Because obviously, while they do majority for him, right, we cannot say that they're not independent if they're not always ruling for him. Why is it that they want to do this, right? And she positioned something that I'm going to read out loud. Now, Shai was talking about how she speaks with her lawyer friends and her law school professor friends, and they discussed about what truly is wrong with the Supreme Court, right? You know what we say about the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court is afraid to rule against Trump because they do not believe that he will follow orders. And note, the presidential immunity decision proves this because what did they say? Basically, the argument was that if a president believes that they can be prosecuted, they will not leave. So they do not see themselves as having the capacity to enforce them to leave, right? And let's continue. And because the Supreme Court has neither sworn, it cannot raise an army. A state can, or PERS, the federal does, right? But the blue states give the taxation that gives a good amount of this funding. I'm just saying, but let's continue. It does not have the ability to allocate funds. That's true. Congress does, and it's consolidated. So what now, right? It is premised entirely on legitimacy. Its legitimacy attribution feature, right? So its only reasoning for existing is because we deem it as legitimate. So they have no incentive to disprove themselves as illegitimate by doing the right thing and actually ruling against him and then risking him to literally go against him, right? And the legitimacy we attribute to it. You see, that's the literal reason that it can exist is because we believe that it needs to exist because it's a constitutional element, right? So if the courts fail, then that means the constitution is weak, right? Which means a constitutional crisis, which means what? That the courts aren't working, which means what? That we have much more power outside the traditional constitutional mandate, right? That is a dissolution of the rule of law. All it has is legitimacy. The moment Trump doesn't follow one of their orders, that legitimacy is gone. So they refuse to rule in a way that will cause him to go against them. It'll be clear that their legitimacy is gone. And why is that important? Because as what is inscribed on the DOJ building in Washington, D.C., John Locke positioned wherever law ends, tyranny begins, right? And in fact, Federalist 78 by Alexander Hamilton positions that there is no liberty if the power of judging be not separated from the legislative, so Congress, and executive power, so POTUS, right? And in fact, it positions that through the mediums of courts of justice, whose duty it must be to declare all acts contrary to the voice of the Constitution void. So cancel it out. Without this independence to the constitutional supremacy, other reservations of particular rights or privileges would amount to nothing. So that would dilute the political rights, which is what we're seeing, right? When it comes to birthright, the Equal Protection Clause. So for good measure, they must say, well, we don't have the power to enforce, right? What they're positioning is this. Federalist 47 by the fourth POTUS, James Madison, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, so Congress, the executive, the president, and judiciary, the courts, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary or self appointed or elected, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. And the argument here would be that we cannot maximize on constitutional resolution, so go against that unless we can exhaust the courts, right? And that's probably what blue state governors are trying to do by, suing everyone. But ultimately, authoritarian law manipulates, and the courts at the highest level are forced to actually cuddle him, right? Because they don't want to rule against him and risk him going against them. That's what happened to birthright citizenship, right? They said even if it is unconstitutional, and we are positioning that a state first has to sue, the attorney general has to sue in order for them to be capable of automatically having constitutional protections. Even if that were the case, we cannot say whether or not the courts have the authority to actually enforce that across the states, right? And that stems from what Shai is saying, right? They don't want to risk him going against them, and in order to do that, they're going to go for him. Appeasement. And yes, John Locke positions there can be no pretense for force, which is only to be used where a man is intercepted from appealing to the law. But further, it positions that because the one using force would threaten my life, I could not have time to appeal to the law to secure it. And when it was gone, it was too late to appeal. The law could not restore life to my dead carcass. The laws are irreparable, which, and to prevent the law of nature, give me a right to destroy him who had put himself into a state of war with me and threatened my destruction. So it positions that at some point, if you cannot get through litigation, right, because ultimately they're maximizing on their harm into our physical, then that means we alter into a different sort of contract. Federalist 28 by Alexander Hamilton positions a good amount of what this means. I'm not going to touch a lot on it because it's why I got my first account permanently banned. But there's a part where it says, power being almost always the rival of power, the federal government will at times stand ready to check the usurpations of the state governments, and these will have the same disposition towards the federal government. The people, by throwing themselves into either side, will make it more successful. If their rights are invaded by either, they can make use of the other as instrument of redress, so as solution, right? The obstacles to usurpation and the facilities of resistance increase with the increased extent of the government, provided the citizens understand their rights and are disposed to defend them. The natural strength of the people in a large community in proportion to the artificial strength of the government is greater than in a small, and of course more competent to struggle with the attempts of the government to establish a tyranny. And it actually authorizes that the federal is not always above the state. In fact, there is a mandate that a state utilize all maximum powers, including that of equal enforcement, in order to ensure that constitutional liberties are secured. And we need to recognize that lawsuits help, but lawsuits will not save us, and voting helps, voting will not save us. We have to be the ones who do that, and that's not going to happen for us being safe and being scared of defending against violent acts. And I'm gonna leave it at that because I'm still traumatized about my first account being banned just without strikes. So I guess we'll see how this one goes.